So, how can an investor help strengthen their petition and improve their chances of an approval? Focusing on, right, 18 second. So, we're going to talk today about strengthening your EB-5 I-526E petition by focusing on your source of funds documentation. What are some of the things you can do to improve your petition, to create a better track record, to show your lawful source of funds? As always, nothing that I'm saying during these live sessions is giving you legal advice, so you should consult with your immigration attorney regarding the facts that specifically pertain to your case. But hopefully, these sessions are educational and they give you some talking points and ideas to discuss with your immigration attorneys. And of course, when it comes to project selection, for due diligence, review, and so on, it is a good idea to work with a licensed FINRA broker dealer. So you should be advising professionals such as an immigration attorney or a licensed FINRA broker regarding your specific case and your specific needs. But these live sessions are for educational purposes. So I will share some pointers in how a petition can be improved through properly documenting lawful source of funds. So an important thing to understand, and my background is I practiced immigration law for 10 years, specialized in EB-5 cases, filed literally hundreds and hundreds of cases with a very, very good track record. My rate of approval was higher than the national average, so by a lot. So I do like to talk about this subject and some of the things that we did that I think helped our clients get to that higher approval rate and some of the latest trends. So number one, the EB-5 program does not require showing your entire net worth, right? So you don't have to document your entire wealth. You have to document the lawful source and path of the funds you're specifically investing in EB-5. So that's an important distinction because sometimes people come from other countries or just their own perspective and they focus on trying to provide documentation about their income or wealth as a whole versus focusing on the specifically 800,000 or whatever the minimum is. And that can both be a distracting factor from your lawful source of funds. Plus, when you feel like you're documenting your entire wealth, say it's 5 million, you may give too much attention to your entire wealth and not enough attention and not enough detail to the specific 800,000 you're investing. So focus on the specific funds you're investing plus any administrative fees that you're paying to the regional center. That also needs to be traced as part of your source of funds. So understand that you need to do a few things. You need to explain how the money was derived in a lawful way, so how it was earned, inherited, and how it was essentially earned and produced in a lawful way. Then you need to show the path of how it got to the project to confirm that the same money that you showed as lawful is the same money that is in the project. And sometimes you have to show the accumulation of funds. So if this is money that was being earned over many years, it may not just be sufficient to show tax returns. You will want to show also bank statements showing that, salary deposits, dividend deposits, to connect the dots, to show that the specific money you showed how you earned, like through tax returns, is also the same money that you're investing, right? So lawfully earned, accumulated, and transferred. Now, this accumulation point is not specifically in the law. It is something USCIS likes to ask about. So it is a little bit of a vague standard of what's enough. If I was receiving a salary for 10 years and it was being deposited in my various bank accounts, do I really need to provide 10 years of bank statements showing every single deposit of my salary? My personal opinion that it would be overly burdensome and unnecessary because the standard of proof in EB-5 is preponderance of evidence, meaning you have to show enough documentation that it makes the truth more likely than the opposite fact. So I personally think if I'm showing tax returns, employer letters, and sample deposits to show these deposits were being made into my checking account, then my personal opinion is that showing 10 years of bank statements with every single pay stub is excessive. But don't be surprised if some officers may ask for that level of detail, right? So again, we're talking about what will improve your case, not necessarily what's legally required. Um, if you have all these bank statements, I would recommend collecting them and at least saving them. You may not necessarily want to volunteer them in your initial I-526 filing, again, because it could be, I think, overly burdensome and extensive. But it is something that's nice to have for your own folder in case you do have a stricter officer and they send you a request for evidence. So, what are some of the common ways that people have earned funds? And I'll sort of glance over the easy ones. Listen, if you're working for a large employer, especially in the United States, you're receiving, if it's a multinational organization, you're receiving salaried income. They're paying your taxes, you're paying your taxes. The money goes into your checking accounts via automatic payroll records. That's not much of USCIS is concerned, right? If you work for Meta or Pfizer or some other international organization, it's pretty obvious from these tax returns and your employment records that your funds were probably earned in a lawful way, right? The challenge, I think, becomes is if you're a small business entrepreneur or if you're receiving funds from family or friends or partial funds, right? So maybe some of your funds are earned in your salary job, but then you're also borrowing 200,000 or 300,000, and that money is coming from overseas where the record keeping standards are different. And so that's what I would focus a little bit more attention on. Anything, lawful gifts are fine, a loan is fine, but you want to make sure you document as much as possible. And when records are not available, you use secondary evidence. So that's my, I think, biggest kind of lesson that I want to explain and elaborate in this live. Direct versus indirect evidence in EB-5. So if I'm receiving a gift from a family member and I say that she earned that money through her own business, direct evidence of that would be tax returns for that business in the years that she earned it, plus transfers to her bank account and a transfer to me. That's very direct evidence and directly confirms what we're saying. But a lot of times when we're sourcing funds for EB-5, direct evidence is no longer available. So if my aunt made this money more than 5 years ago, she may no longer have the business records, right? Because maybe the local jurisdiction requires her to keep business records for 4 or 5 years. It's been 7 years. She doesn't have a copy. She could go to the local tax services, ask them for a copy, but most jurisdictions will only provide you tax records for the past 3 to 5 years. So, what can we use as indirect evidence? So, number one, if you don't have direct evidence, you don't have the tax records, you don't have the bank steps, try to find as much indirect evidence that collaborates your story. For example, uh, contracts, copies of contracts that she had, if this was her own company, and she had contracts with vendors, suppliers, you can use those to show and confirm that she was engaged in lawful activity. Um, Additionally, certain records are kept pretty much forever by most jurisdictions, such as business records from business registration records. So she may not have tax returns for her company, but she should still be able to obtain business registration records to at least tying her to that company. Um, you can do indirect evidence can include articles from reputable sources such as Deloitte Consulting Company and other companies where they elaborate for different types of businesses what is an average profit margin, right? Or what's the average income. So maybe that can corroborate her story about how much money she was making if she owned that specific business. Form a business website, pictures of the office, pictures of the store, letters from former employees. Um, there are plenty. If it was an import-export company, maybe tariffs that they paid, upon shipping or receiving of the shipment. So literally any document that confirms that she was genuinely engaged in that business activity, that makes it much more likely that if she was engaged in that business activity, she was making a living or earning money, even if you don't have the exact tax returns. So indirect evidence is very important in EB-5. I highly, highly recommend it because sometimes people get stuck on, well, I don't have this direct piece of paper, so I'm just not going to submit it. It's no longer available. That's fine, but you can corroborate your story with so many additional, kind of confirming fact patterns. Articles. One time I was working with a client who sold his company 30 years ago. There were no bank records, there were no transactions. It's been 30 years, right? But we did find an article in a local paper that described the sale because it was a sale of a factory and it was kind of a big deal for that town. And it described him, what the company was, and who he sold it to, because he sold it to a multinational corporation. So we were able to use that evidence plus the business registration record to show that, yes, he was the owner and he sold his business for a substantial amount of money, and then corroborate that with him having savings in international banks for 30 years. And that was sufficient clean evidence to meet that preponderance of evidence standard. So, uneasy cases obviously provide direct evidence. If direct evidence is not available, think of literally anything, whether it's affidavits, statements, articles that confirm what you're trying to say. This often happens when I have an inheritance or a gift coming through and it's being utilized for EB-5. And maybe the person who gave the gift is no longer around, they're either no longer alive, or we simply don't have evidence of their activity. Maybe they were a doctor, but they retired 20 years ago. So, what can serve as indirect evidence? Their diplomas, their certificates, their licenses. Again, letters from former employer or colleagues or clients, articles about their activity, any sort of achievements that they have, awards. Because again, if I can clearly establish the fact that someone was a licensed practitioner, whether it's an architect, a doctor, or a lawyer, and I can confirm through these articles and the activity that they were engaged in lawful practice for many years, that helps confirm that they in fact were earning a lawful income, right? It makes it much more likely that they were genuinely making a lawful income from their job as an architect versus that they were also running some illegal operation on the side. Because frankly, if you're a busy professional, if you're getting awards in your industry, you usually don't have time to also have a side hustle of illegal drug sales, right? So indirect evidence, very, very important. 7 years of tax returns. So until maybe year 2025, tax returns, although the regulations do say provide 7 years of tax returns, personal and business as applicable, the as applicable term was kind of being treated that if it pertains to your lawful funds. So if I have tax returns for the past 4 years, but I'm not investing money that I earned, I'm investing money that came to me as a gift from a friend or family, then providing my tax returns, in again, my opinion, would not be very relevant, right? Because it doesn't source the funds. Lately, we have seen that USCIS is requesting tax returns, even if they're not directly related to your source of funds. So the petitioner should be providing 7 years of tax returns, personal and business, right? Do I believe that this is rooted in the law, this requirement? No, I personally do not believe that. I believe that is the current interpretation of USCIS, but we're talking about improving your cases and approval rates. The question becomes, do you want to argue with USCIS over the law, or do you want to just kind of understand that this is their current interpretation? And if you have those records, it's better to provide it. Also, if you don't have those records, if you don't have your 7 years of tax returns, or you were not subject to filing a tax return because maybe your income was under the threshold, or your income didn't qualify for maybe you were in a tax-free jurisdiction, then you really need to provide a proactive statement. Do not think USCIS is going to send you an RFE or a NOID, so request for evidence or notice of intent to deny. If you didn't provide something, don't think, oh, they're going to ask me for it if they want it. They don't have to ask you. They can just deny your petition. And we have been seeing an upward trend of that. Back in the day, if they thought there was not enough documentation, they would send you a request for that documentation. They don't do that anymore. A lot of times USCIS will just deny your case and state in the reason that you didn't provide something. So if you were not subject to taxation, if you are under a threshold, it is best to provide a proactive statement explaining why you didn't have tax returns. And obviously, if this can be corroborated by someone else, like if you were in a tax-free jurisdiction where there is no income tax, you can get a letter from a local attorney that states so, and you can use that letter as evidence. Expert letters and expert opinions, one of my favorite strategies on how to improve your case. A lot of times, you as an investor will know, for example, in the country where I live, if you own real estate for 3 years and then you sell it, you do not pay tax on income. If you owned it for less than 3 years, you pay tax on that income. You know this, everybody knows this, right? In your country. A USCIS officer may not know this. So if you're presenting your case and you make that statement, or your attorney, your immigration attorney in the US makes a statement and explains, in this jurisdiction, you're not subject to taxation after 3 years, that is not considered subjective evidence, right? That is a self-interested statement that you're making or your representative is making. However, it may help, but it's not evidence. However, if you get a local letter from a local CPA, licensed certified public accountant, or a local attorney to write a letter saying, per this provision of this law of this country, if you own real estate for more than 3 years, you don't pay tax. That letter now serves as an objective piece of evidence because it is an interpretation of the law of the facts by a local professional. And these letters are usually very inexpensive to obtain. To write a basic statement like this, most attorneys would only charge a few $100s. Depending on the jurisdiction you're in, it could even be cheaper. Sometimes to write an entire professional report on an issue, it's only a couple $1,000s. And that can really strengthen your case. So for me, anytime you're trying to explain something based on the local jurisdiction in your EB-5 petition, it is best if you engage a local professional to write you an actual professional letter instead of just using your own words. Your immigration attorney can summarize it in their own words, but it is nice. Expert letters to be added to your petition as evidence is a great idea to establish facts and make your petition much stronger. So I'm going to summarize so you guys don't forget some of the things I mentioned. To make your petition stronger, number one, use direct evidence whenever possible, so direct document confirming what you said. When direct evidence is not available, use any other pieces of evidence, whether it's articles or letters, to confirm that what you're saying is more likely than not, or to confirm some of the facts. So if I say, my father was a doctor who had a good salary and he saved money throughout his years, direct evidence would be bank statements and tax returns. If I don't have that, then at least I can find evidence that confirms some of what I'm saying. My father was a doctor. Great. I can confirm that with his diplomas. He worked through most of his life. I can confirm it by him having accomplishment or awards in his industry. So if I can confirm some of the facts of what I'm saying, it helps to strengthen your petition. So direct evidence, indirect evidence, expert letters whenever available, accumulation of funds whenever available, especially if you can obtain bank records and statements. And let's see, those are, I think, that some of the big ones that we have covered so far. And the next one is basic charts and graphs. USCIS officers are dealing with a lot of petitions, and sometimes they can deny your case simply due to a mistake that they make. If you're going to write your letter and you have 800,000 and a lot of that money was moving around, so you took 50,000 here, put it in a CD, you took 50,000 here, put it in a stock market, you took 50,000, you gave it to your sister, you lent it to her, she gave it back 2 years later. You can describe it all in words, right? You will type it out and you will present evidence, but an officer is reading dozens of these petitions and they're looking through pages and pages. They may get confused, and as they're trying to calculate all these movements, they can make a mistake. So make it easier on them and create a visual graph, like actual visual pockets, like a little flow chart. And you can use whatever format of a graph that you want. You can probably at this point ask AI based on the narrative, help you create the graph, just make like whether it's a pie chart or a flow chart. But those graphs are very important. They help to make your case visually more clear. They help the officer not make a mistake when they're calculating all the different things you've written out in different paragraphs. And I have even seen USAS officers sometimes issue an RFE just asking for the flowchart graph. So it is a good tool that's going to make your presentation more clear and visually easier to read and less likely that the officer will make a mistake. And let me tell you, I have seen officers, even in very simple cases, issue either a request for evidence or even a denial because they miscalculated what was written out. Right? When they were trying to add up what was written in paragraph 1, paragraph 2, paragraph 3, they miscalculated, they didn't get the full amount at the end, and would issue a denial. So these flow charts doing the calculations for them are very helpful. So visual presentation, I am a huge proponent of visual evidence, period, because it's one thing to say my client had this retail shop and these are the tax returns, or maybe you don't have tax returns for certain years and these are partial tax returns. It's another thing to actually provide photographs of the shop, maybe with your client in it, because visually it does help to really show that your story is much more likely to be true because you have all this actual visual evidence of them owning the storefront, having all this inventory, which just makes it much more likely that they were genuinely engaged in unlawful activity. And especially for like service businesses, because sometimes you look at service businesses, a new company got started, next thing you know, 2 or 3 years later, they're receiving millions of dollars in revenue. And it just naturally looks suspicious. Like, how did you go from zero to millions of dollars in revenue? But if you can show the presentations of whatever it was, the store, the spa, the visual showing like this is what my client was doing, it does help to it does help to create that credibility where the officer really starts to believe the story. Another thing is explaining, really understanding how your business works and explaining it well. You saying I'm an import expert, that's fantastic. What does that mean, right? If I as an officer don't understand how you made money, I'm going to be much more likely to deny you, because if you just say, I'm an import expert, I started this company 3 years ago with $5,000 startup capital, and by year 2, we're doing $3 million of revenue, and $1.5 million of that is pure profit, so I distributed a dividend. That can seem suspicious. That can seem like funneling money, money laundering. I don't see your actual activity. How did you start a new business and get to millions of dollars in revenue in a generally competitive industry? So an explanation saying 10 years before that, I worked for an import export company. I have built relationships with suppliers, with vendors, da 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 da, and saw what were some of the unmet needs for people who wanted to buy goods in this particular area and some of the vendors who wanted to sell it. So when I started my own company, it was already on the basis of those relationships and to fulfill the specific orders that other companies were not fulfilling. Right? So the more you can explain your situation in layman's term and provide a comprehensive narrative, that's what we like to call it, like an actual story from the investor, outlining how you earned the funds, what your background is, what your skill set that helped it. The more clear your story is, the more your documents are used as a corroborative evidence, the more likely the officer is going to feel comfortable and confident approving your case. Right? Because sometimes and I've seen this happen a lot in our industry, some attorneys or some paralegals, they will focus on the bank documents and they will sort of robotically explain this amount of money came in from this account, then it moved here, then it moved here, then it moved here. But there's no overall picture or story. There's no client resume explaining what his skill set is, how he improved his skill set, and why people were willing to pay him $100,000 consulting fees. Right? So these are important, explaining the narrative of who you are, how you make money, what your skill set is, and then corroborating it with documentation. Right? So let's refresh: direct evidence, indirect evidence whenever available, expert letters for sure. Then, of course, accumulation of funds whenever available, and flowcharts, and a narrative, comprehensive narrative from the investor. Also, one of the things that is basically treated as a mandatory thing today is the investor's resume or the donor's resume, whoever is providing the funds. Outline your work history, explaining kind of again how you reached the level that you reached today. A very important thing. This is something I see hurt a lot of investor petitions. Your resume and your source of funds and the work history you're describing in your EB-5 petition should be consistent with your prior non-immigrant visa applications. So if you previously filed for a tourist visa, an E2 visa, a student visa, and there in that application, you were indicating an employer. What I see a lot with entrepreneurs is an entrepreneur may own 3 different companies at the same time. But when they file an application for a tourist visa, in that application, they only indicate one of the companies, maybe their main one at that time. 5 years later, they're filing for EB-5 and they're showing me income from a company they were operating 5 years earlier. USCIS loves to take your EB-5 petition and take your past tourist, non-immigrant, student visa applications and compare them. They have easy access to your records from immigration. So if you previously filed for any kind of visa, they have access to those records and they will compare your work history. So if you notice that in your prior work history for your visa application, you didn't list every single company where you're a shareholder or had a participation, you want to clearly explain that in your EB-5 petition, saying my main job was with this company, but I also invested in this one. I also was a consultant in this one, and it's that third one that grew and derived all this income, which I'm now using for EB-5. Just make sure you complete the picture, right? Because if you have company A listed in your tourist petition and you're showing that your income came from company C, which also has been in existence for years, and you don't reconcile the record, it starts to look like an inconsistency. You said you worked for company A 5 years ago, but now you're saying company C was founded 5 years ago and you made all this money from it. How does it how does it work with what your prior statements? So make sure you reconcile those statements to make sure that they are comprehensive. All right, what else? To improve your petition. I mean, keep in mind you can use loans. So if you own a company, it's not mandatory for you to distribute income, pay tax on that income, and invest in your distributed income in EB-5. If you own a company, the company has undistributed profits, and your company is willing to give you a shareholder loan that you take and pay interest, that's fine. A lot of individuals take a shareholder loan from their own company and use it towards their EB-5 and then repay the loan back into the company. You can also use loans from individuals, personal individuals, other small companies. If you're taking a loan from a non-banking organization, if it's not from a bank, you must also show the source of funds from the company or the individual from whom you're borrowing money. So that's very important. If your friend is willing to lend you money for EB-5, make sure that friend is absolutely willing to provide all the source of funds documentation, and make sure your friend is going to be available for future requests for evidence if any arrive. All right, so inherited funds, gifted funds, commingling. This is the point that personally to me, it's so clear and so obvious, but for some reason, I would say at least half of people do not think like me and they find this very strange. If you commingled funds in the one account, so say I have $1 million from a sale of an asset, and I clearly outlined how I bought the asset, it grew in value, I sold it. I trace 1 million perfectly. I have a perfect trace. Then I take that million and I deposit it into an account where there's another 50,000, right? So now there's 1,050,000. And then I go and I invest 800 plus fees, 880,000 in EB-5. So many investors say, well, I traced the million and I'm only investing 880. So I traced everything I need to do. But you commingled it with the other 50. And USCIS, because you put it all in one account, it's mixed. Now they don't know, did you transfer 800,000 from the million you traced, or did you transfer the 50 plus some of the money? So to me, that concept is very simple. If you have clean coins and untraced coins and you throw them in the same basket and you mix them and then you take out a certain amount of coins, now you need to show how the untraced coins were derived. Because when you take out coins, it could be both traced and untraced. Same with any commingling of any funds. You cannot say, oh, I explained this million, now I'm going to put the money in an account with other money that I never explained, then transfer it to a project, and we're going to all pretend that it came from that million. So commingling your funds means that you have to explain the whole basket, right? And sometimes it's tough because sometimes I see it for families that are a little bit more affluent. They may have their entire family wealth in one brokerage account. So instead of now having to trace 800,000, we're tracing $5 million because all of the money is in one account. We have to explain where all of it came from. So commingling of the funds means that you're going to have to provide the trace for all the money in the funds. I've personally once had a request for evidence for $10,000. Client, we traced her funds. She transferred it to her US bank account. And then when the transfer was made, due to the currency conversion change that week, she came out 10,000 short of her investment amount. So she asked for her father, who also had another account in the US, to basically gift her 10,000. So he transfers 10,000 and she takes all of that money and transferred it to the project. Of course, it was nice as her attorney to find out this after the fact, that they came out $10,000 short and it was added from an account they didn't kind of check with me on. Long story short, USCIS did send a request for evidence asking where did this 10,000 come from? What was the source of it? Who earned it? Thank goodness we did have those documents to be provided, but no matter how small the amount, if you mix the funds, they will want to know the origin or how large the amount. If it's $10 million in one account, you're now explaining all 10 million. So be mindful of commingling of the funds. If you have clean funds, don't put it in the account. Clean, traceable funds, right? I'm not saying your other funds are not clean, but maybe you don't have the documentation to trace it back. So if you have clean, traceable funds, try to keep those funds segregated until they go to the project. If you're transferring to a bank account, you can have a bank account that has money in it, and then you empty it. So you can open either a new bank account that starts with a zero, or you can have a bank account with money, empty it, transfer it to savings or something, and you can use that empty account with a zero balance account where you can transfer your traceable funds. So those are some of the things that help. And last but not least, one of my other tips I like to give to people is confirming negative statements. And what I mean by that, if you want to add credibility to your petition, because it's all about adding additional documents to improve your credibility, right? If I have a negative statement, for example, I need tax returns from 5 years ago. I don't have a copy. I went to the local tax authority and they told me, sorry, we can only provide you copies of tax returns for the past 3 years. That's how long we keep the archives. If I tell this to my immigration attorney and we just write it in my memo saying archives are only available for 3 years, can't provide you documents, USCIS officer has a big question in their mark, like, is that true? Or are they just saying that, right? Because they don't want me to see the tax returns. But so if I can't obtain something, it's best to get the actual letter from the source confirming that they will not give this to me. So if I went to tax authority and they said, we cannot give you records past three years, ask them to give you a letter and use that letter in your petition to confirm, listen, this is not me trying to hide my tax returns. They genuinely are not available and I cannot obtain a copy. If you went to a bank and asked for past bank statements and the bank said, sorry, your account has been closed, we don't provide bank statements for accounts that are closed, get a letter from a banker confirming that I made a request for this account number and such date. The request was declined because the bank doesn't keep these records anymore. No, so anytime you have to present information, anytime you're telling a USCIS officer something is not available, it is best if it doesn't just come from your mouth, but there's an actual letter from the organization that showing that you made an effort to obtain those documents and it was not possible to do it. What does it prove? It helps to prove you're not a liar. That's basically, in simple terms. It creates credibility that, hey, I'm not just saying something is not available. I genuinely tried to obtain it and um, it's not available. So improves your credibility, improves your overall case. It's been nice to see that overall EB-5 approval rates have been very high in 2024 and 2025. Something like the average approval rate for I-526 petitions was over 95%, which in my opinion, as a professional in this industry, that's how it should be. USCIS should be very clear in advance about what documentation they expect to see. And because EB-5 investors don't want to spend $1 million, investment plus fees, and file a case that has a low chance of approval. They would rather not do the process. This isn't free for them. A lot of other immigration petitions, they're, other than paying the legal fees, it doesn't cost them anything, right? They're just documenting their past achievements so they can try to file a petition even if it doesn't have a high average chance of approval. EB-5 is very different because we demand so much from the investor ahead of time, a full investment. Their money is committed in a project for years and years, often not making a return, and they're taking a risk on that investment. These EB-5 investors will self-filter out if they know they don't have a high chance of approval. So, in my opinion, USCIS should be communicating with us more clearly what they need so that EB-5 investors that don't think they can qualify just will not be applying. So that's been nice to see that the approval rates were actually high. Obviously, we're under a different administration now, and this is, June 2026. The current administration sometimes can be tougher in cases that I think that more properly documented, but so I would be even more vigilant, try to provide even more evidence that is probably beyond the legal requirement standard of preponderance of evidence. But it does improve your chances of having the petition approved instead of having to argue with USCIS over the approval. So I hope this was helpful. And, again, I'll summarize indirect and direct evidence. expert letters whenever available. If you cannot obtain something, try to get a note or a letter from the organization saying you tried to obtain it and it was not possible. Provide flowcharts, provide resume, provide an overall narrative from the investor that explains how the money was made. Provide your work history and compare it with your prior non-immigrant visa petitions to make sure that any what may seem like an inconsistency is explained and you provide enough detail for the officers to understand it. And accumulation of the funds whenever possible. So good luck, and of course discuss your individual case with your immigration attorney, but those are some tips on how to make your case look and feel stronger and better.